Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. Thank you all for being here. I'm so glad that you can join us. Welcome to our final book in our series, Let's Talk About It. We're going to be discussing Raising LGBTQ Allies, a Parent's Guide to Changing the Message from the Playground. We have the fortune of having Chris Tompkins, the author, with us tonight as well. Now, we will be recording this session and it will be made available at a later time. Throughout the conversation, or if you have any now, please feel free to submit your questions and comments in the Q&A box down below. If we're unable to get through all of them, it will be submitted, or you can submit your questions later and I can get them to the panel after the program. So I'm extremely pleased to introduce you to our panel-led discussion this evening and our panelists. Joining us today, we have Kevin Moore. He was on our first panel, or was it the second? First one, I believe. Kevin graduated from Southwestern in 1999 with degrees in political science and theater and was a member of Phi Delta Theta. After 17 years in the classroom at Shepton High School in Plano ISD, Kevin moved to Central Administration, where he currently serves as Plano ISD's Director of Advanced Academics. Kevin remains active in numerous Dallas stages and has been named Actor of the Year and Favorite Dallas Actor by the Dallas Voice. Kevin holds an MED from the University of North Texas and is completing the dissertation for his PhD in Curriculum Studies, which examines a personal and professional identity development in lesbian and gay pre-service teachers. Kevin is married to his husband Joel in 2017 and lives in Dallas with their dog Max and cat Olivia Pope. And joining us also is Sherry Babcock. She's a 1970 alumna and retired for the first time from Southwestern in 2003 as Southwestern University Vice President and Dean of Students. Then started a company, then retired again as VP and Emily and Richard Smucker Chair of Education at Chautauqua Institution in New York. She is also a current member of the Alumni Council as the Nominations and Awards Chair. She has been an ally since she was a young adult and raised 3 ally stepdaughters, 1 ally daughter, and 1 ally husband. And also joining us is Chris Tompkins. He's a teacher, speaker, life coach, and parenting consultant based in Los Angeles, California. More importantly, he's an uncle of 5. Chris believes all kids are the future and has taught social emotional learning throughout Southern California. As I mentioned earlier, he's also the author of this book for tonight's discussion. We're honored to have his insights as we dive in. Thank you all for serving on the panel this evening, and I will turn the program over to you. Chris, will you share with us your motivation for writing this book?
Yeah, thank you. Wow. Well, first off, it's wonderful to be here. I'm so honored and grateful to have been extended the invitation to be able to talk about my book and to be able to be here and have these conversations. The motivation really was from my own life, my own experience. And I kind of I started out the beginning of the book really writing about a question that my nephew had asked me. And I was at home. I'm from Arizona. I live in Los Angeles, but I was in Arizona, ironically giving a workshop at the Arizona Equality and Justice Conference, which was up in Phoenix, which was an LGBTQ related conference. And so after that conference, I went home to my mom's house and she had a bunch of my family, extended family over. And my nephew, amongst all the other kids, they were running around and playing, and my nephew ran over and asked me his version of whispering. I often share this story, but his version of whispering was talking out loud. So he ran over to me and whispered, "Uncle Chris, is she your girlfriend?" to the woman that was sitting next to me. And everyone started laughing and it was really cute. And then it started to occur to me as the day progressed, why did he ask me that question? And then I started to realize, like, oh, okay, so maybe his parents haven't talked to him. Because I live in California, my family lives in Arizona. I wasn't dating anyone at the time, so I had never brought someone home with me to my family. And so then the next day I asked my mom why my nephew had asked me if this person was my girlfriend, and if my brother and sister had talked to their kids about me being gay, about them having a gay uncle. And my mom's response was, oh, Chris, they're too young to understand. And my mom is supportive, and she has been supportive. And so I realized in that moment, there are nuances to these conversations, homophobia. And what's more, and what I talk about a lot in my book, is heteronormativity, which I think when we think of homophobia, we often, and I also write about this in the book, we often think of a blatant kind of a verbal or physical attack, and it can oftentimes be silence. And so the heteronormativity that is just part of, unfortunately, it's the more pervasive form, I think, of where a lot of homophobia extends from, transphobia, heterosexism. And so then I started to ask family members, cousins of mine, friends of mine who had kids, and a lot of them had the same response. Well, I don't know what to say, or they're too young to understand, or I'm not sure how to talk about it. And so then that really set me, that was in 2015. And so then I felt like I really had something to say. I felt like I had something that I wanted to share with families, because it wasn't just about me. I started to realize there are cousins of mine right now, second cousins, a whole nother generation that could be LGBTQ. And by their families not considering that as a possibility, they're just perpetuating the closet. And my experience of growing up in the closet, and that caused a lot of harm in my life. It was painful. And so I wanted to prevent that from that being the case. And so I wrote a letter to my family, and then that letter ended up being an article that was published first on the Huffington Post, and then it started getting published other places as well. And then it turned into a workshop that I started to give, because I went to a conference here in Los Angeles for the largest, it's called Penny Lane. It's the largest child welfare agency in Los Angeles County. And every year they put on a one-day workshop. It's an all-day event, but it's one day a year, called EDGY. And it's the EDGY conference. And the EDGY conference is specifically for youth-serving professionals who work with LGBTQ youth. And so it's a sort of training to help youth-serving professionals to service the youth that they serve. And so I was at that conference, and the gentleman at one of the workshops that I was sitting right next to raised his hand before the workshop started. And I share this story in the book, but he said that he worked at Central Juvenile Hall in Los Angeles County, and they had a transgender youth at their facility. And there was a Catholic priest that would come and visit the youth to offer services. And upon finding out that this young girl was transgender, he went up to her and put his hand on his heart, and put his hand on her heart and said, "You need an exorcism, may God be with you." And he shared that in the room in front of everyone, and said that they needed help at Juvenile Hall to work with their LGBTQ youth that they had incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And so then I approached him. And so that was kind of the intersection of me having the conversation with my family, my nephew asking me that question, me teaching social emotional learning, and then going to that conference and hearing that gentleman share that story, and me bringing the social emotional learning classes that I was teaching to Central Juvenile Hall. And so that was really the motivation. And then it's been a 7-year journey of eventually writing the book, and it was released this past summer. So it's kind of the longer / shorter version of the story. So Serena, you turned off camera, but I don't know if you had another question.
I think at this point, you guys can go ahead and engage in conversation with each other. So if anyone wants to comment on their impressions of the book
I'm just
or has
glad
something
you
to say.
wrote it. I'm just glad you wrote it. I would have liked to have had it back when I was at Southwestern as Dean of Students, maybe even as a student, but certainly when I was serving the young women and men at Southwestern University. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. That's one of my hopes with the book, is to be able to get into the hands of teachers and youth serving professionals. Right now I'm in graduate school working toward getting my master's in clinical psychology. And it's interesting because even in the classes that I'm in right now, when it comes to child development, the classes that I'm taking right now, it's kind of, we talk about the main curriculum, like what it, you know, when it comes to, you know, being a clinician and a therapist and working with families. And then we have the main kind of conversation, and then we have the classes that are designated for LGBTQ related matters. And so, and I go to a pretty progressive, what's considered a social justice graduate school here in Los Angeles. And so I'm still finding that even in those spaces, there has to be a concerted effort to incorporate what it's like for a transgender, gender nonconforming, gay, lesbian, bisexual, kind of incorporating these conversations, not just in specific spaces, but to kind of incorporate them into the overall dialogue. Because then, you know, unless you're actively doing this work, you're kind of being trained with the specific heteronormative lens that I kind of talk about as it relates to even my own family who love me and support me, and they just didn't know what they didn't know.
I found that really helpful, the way that you broke down some of you didn't assume that people knew things about any one subset of the community, and the diagram of the gender unicorn was pretty awesome. Just because people they get their information from so many different places, I think people now are more aware of especially gender issues than they have been, but there's still a lot of questions and confusion and just misconceptions about how to communicate with people, treat people, but you come from a place of acceptance and love and support just unconditionally for everyone, that it's hard to deny that should be extended towards, you know, even people that are, you know, sexually diverse, gender diverse. So I thought that it was done in a way that brings everyone in, and I thought that was a very powerful message. And also the fact that it is one kid at a time, that it's not something that's going to be some sort of blanket cure for these issues.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for saying that, Kevin, because, you know, one of the really kind of the subtitle of my book is A Parent's Guide to Changing the Messages from the Playground. And Messages from the Playground is an analogy that I often use that kind of speaks to your point, Kevin, as far as it's a doorway into helping everyone kind of understand that we all played on the same playground. And what I mean by that is that when I taught social emotional learning for the past 6-7 years, ages, you know, young as 13 years old, upwards of, you know, early 20s. And what I found over the course of 6 or 7 years is that no matter what class I was teaching, whether it was in Los Angeles Central Juvenile Hall with kids who were 18 and 17 years old, or it was down in Orange County with kids who were 13 at a summer camp, whenever we would have a class, one of our classes was called Who Am I? And during that class, we would ask, each youth got their own journal, like their own workbook. And we would ask them for this particular class to fill out what they believe about school, what they believe about life, what they believe about money, what they believe about love, like all of these different topics. And the whole point of the class was to help youth learn how to empower themselves. But what was so interesting to me is that no matter what class I taught, I would always bring up the subject of money and ask the class, and I write about this in the book, because money is a subject that usually people have an opinion about. And often what I would hear is young kids as young as 13 would share with me things like money is the root of all evil. And that to me is an example, or money doesn't grow on trees. Like all of these little passed down, even though I'm a completely, 4 decades older than a lot of the kids, well, 3 decades older, that those were things that I heard as well when I was a kid. And so one of my messages with my book is that, yes, we've come a long way and a lot of things have changed. And there also are these kind of societal collective beliefs that we all kind of pick up, consciously or not, that we take on as our own. And so when it comes to money, as an example, a little boy in my class, I remember specifically the story that I wrote in the book is, he raised his hand and said, money was the root of all evil. And I think he was 12. And I remember asking him, oh, that's a pretty charged belief. I'm curious, do you have a job? No, he doesn't have a job. And so, do you make money? Do you earn money? He's like, no. And then the more I started asking him questions, the more he got he responded that wasn't his belief. It was something that his mom always said. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when it comes to these conversations, whether it's about money or whether it's about gender, sexuality, there are these kind of collective beliefs that we carry in ourselves that sometimes prevent us from having conversations. Yeah. And so when it comes to my family, as an example, they attributed being gay with, oh, I don't want to talk to my kids about sex. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I hope to accomplish with this conversation is that sex and sexuality and gender and all of those things are kind of convoluted in one box. And so to kind of help to parse those out in a way that can make space for kids, like you said, Kevin, that are gender and sexual minorities.
Chris, one of the things that I found to be most disturbing about the book was a statement that you're seeing, or that there's some research that indicates that younger people are having increased discomfort with talking about LGBTQ issues and people. And I had to read that 3 times before I realized that is what you said, because I had hope that it was going to change, just because I see a lot of young people but mine is anecdotal, yours was real research, but I see a lot of young people who are just a lot more accepting than I thought previous generations had been.
Yeah.
Is it
yeah.
Is that part of the political environment, or can you share more about that study?
Yeah, I think it's a really, I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's a very complex mm-hmm. conversation. And one of the things that, just before I came, this is the first format that I've been on this particular type of panel, but mm-hmm. I'm not, because I can't see who is all here. Mm-hmm. But what I do know is that a woman who I know in Texas, who is not very far from where Southwestern is, she emailed me this morning, and I know her. She had a podcast called "They Can't All Be Betty," and she's an LGBTQ member of the community herself. And she sent me a photograph of. I hope she doesn't mind that I'm sharing this story, but she was going to come to the panel today, and maybe she can ask a question. But she shared a story, or she sent me an email this morning with a photograph that her and her girlfriend just bought a house in a community. And on the playground, her and her girlfriend took a walk around the neighborhood. And on the playground, there was some graffiti that had just occurred. Some young people had, put some graffiti on the playground. And they wrote on the playground, "Your dad's a lesbian and your mom's gay." And she sent me that photograph along with an email about that was kind of, an example of messages from the playground right there in her own community. Mm-hmm. And so to answer your question, I bring that up as far as you know, what I write about in the book is how sometimes when we have a pendulum swinging, it gets the momentum going. And so you have a lot of progressive conversations, open conversations that are happening, especially with the pandemic, just with regard to social justice conversations in general. And then what happens with momentum is that the pendulum swings the other way. And so right now, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there's a law that is in Florida that's trying to be passed.
Right.
That is called Don't Say Gay. And it's trying to restrict schools from talking about gender and sexuality, which basically would be erasing LGBTQ folks.
The efforts that
and I'm from Arizona, and in Arizona, up until 2 years ago, there was a law on the books called the No Homo Promo Law, which was the same law that is trying to be passed in Florida. So whereas in Arizona, they just repealed that law 2 years ago, you have another law that's appearing in Florida that's trying to be passed. So when I think of those things, I think of those are examples of institutionalized queer phobia. And I say queer phobia to include LGBTQ.
Right.
So those are institutions, but institutions are just a collective of individual beliefs. And so those individual beliefs get passed down. And so to your question, there is a lot of openness happening for sure.
Right.
And
I think a layer of that too, especially with young people, is that for a long time, if the ones that had those kinds of beliefs did not have a platform to speak them, I think a lot of societal norms kept them quiet, and they were still happening, and they were under the breath, they were taunts that we all experienced when we were growing up. But now the platform, they have more of a voice that they're able to have, and they're emboldened to make that known, sometimes anonymously, sometimes not. And because they see people in power that are able to perpetuate those sorts of views. And so they say, well, if they can, I can. And I don't know if you know this, Chris, we have a Yahoo state legislator that has put out a list of, I think, 275 books that he says should be banned from school libraries. And I want to say at least 80% of them are dealing with queer topics.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I like this meme that's going around that has the picture of Ruby Bridges coming out of the school with all of the, as a little bitty girl, with all of the police around her, when the New Orleans schools were desegregated, and she was the one. And the meme says, the meme says, if she's old enough to go through it, your children are old enough to read about it. And she was like 6 years old in that picture and in her story. And that's a meme about race education, which is also a huge issue. But it seems to me that that's a similar kind of situation. If children are old enough to be going through all of the angst that comes from not being accepted and your heteronormative description, then surely other children are old enough to have age-appropriate messages about the differences among children.
Right.
In our world. Yeah. The story of just about your nephew, he doesn't need to know every secret, but he does need to know that you're gay, and that means that you don't have girlfriends. That
right.
And that gives him permission. So.
And to not make assumptions either way. I mean, that's heteronormativity is a thing because it is normative. It's because there has been no alternative. It's because we speak about things in a way that defaults to heterosexuality. And so when we in schools with families. I mean, how many grandparents have seen their 6-year-old come home, 6-year-old grandson, and say, "Do you have a girlfriend yet?" Right. I mean, you're sexualizing your 6-year-old grandson, but in a heteronormative way.
Right, right. That's a really good point, Kevin, because that's one of the things too, to start kind of chipping away at heteronormativity. One of the things that I write about in the book is like little conversations, little things that we can do with kids, you know, instead of just, do you have a boyfriend or do you have a girlfriend? It's kind of like just keeping it open to the possibility. You know, right now, my family, my nieces and nephews, my nephew who was 6 when I started, when he first asked me that question, you know, he just turned 13. So it's, you know, time goes by so fast, but my niece, his sister, his youngest sister, she's now his age when he asked me that question. Mm-hmm. But I was talking to her the other week, we were on the phone FaceTiming, and she was so excited to tell me that her brother had a girlfriend. And she was telling me about about how, you know, he has a girlfriend and da-da-da. And it was just so interesting to me that she's curious. Mm-hmm. She's 6 years old. She's curious about her brother has a girlfriend. Like, oh my gosh. And yet they're not old enough, you know, at the time, you know, my nephew wasn't old enough to understand why I wouldn't have a girlfriend.
Right.
And so that's kind of the discrepancy that I invite parents and caregivers to consider, is an example of heteronormativity. And so when we can start opening it up to the possibility that, you know, our kid could have a girlfriend or a boyfriend.
Because one of the messages I got was that whenever we have these thoughts as parents or teachers or anything, we're putting what we are comfortable with, we're sort of imposing that on kids, and that's doing them a disservice. And so I like that it's almost like we have to do the work first.
Yes.
To deconstruct before we can ever hope to invite these people in.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
How does this play into your PhD?
Well, I mean, it deals a lot with heteronormativity, and especially in educational systems, because a lot of times teachers, the whole idea of bringing your personal life into the classroom, or even getting kids to discuss anything that is personal to them, that a lot of times as teachers or schools feel like they have to put up a wall between those things. And that really does a disservice to kids because they're not able to see people as people. And so they don't feel like they can be themselves because they don't see anybody else that is being themselves. Mm-hmm. That's dangerous.
Yeah. There were 2 findings that I'll deal with the other one in a minute if you're interested. But one of the ones that I was so fascinated with, because my life as an ally really began with the church. I'm a United Methodist, and the church is splitting. The people on the conservative side of that church are saying it's all about homosexuality. The people who are on my side, the progressive side, are saying no, it's a lot of issues, and the main one for me is the hatred that is being expressed from the other side. But when you were talking about the 3rd commandment, I thought, boy, that is an interpretation I have never heard. And it just hit me in a wonderful way that it's not about, for those who haven't read the book, Chris talks about that the 3rd commandment is, thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. And he had always been taught, and I had always been taught, that was about use of swear words or words that use spiritual names in common expressions. And your reinterpretation was a rabbi, wasn't it? Yeah. That commandment means that you don't use God's name to harm people. And right. I found that so helpful.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I had heard that interpretation.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that, because I have a religious background, and I remember the moment I left the rabbi, I wrote that in the book, is the moment I left the rabbi's house, I immediately called my mom.
Yeah.
To share that with her, and she had a similar reaction to yourself, because she's very religious, and she still is, and she and in a good way, she's found a way to kind of similar to you to incorporate her faith, to
Right.
include, to be inclusive. But that was the first time she had heard that interpretation as well. And I
Well,
think
for those of you who haven't read the book, that's a big takeaway for me.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. Yeah, because I think that, when it does come to these societal beliefs, going back to the kid who I had in the class who said that money is the root of all evil.
Right.
That wasn't a religious school. It was a summer camp in Orange County at like a random, and but that speaks to those kind of misinterpreted religious kind of passages that kind of get plucked out and then used in a way that can cause harm. Because how I kind of framed it with that young man is that if he believes that money is the root of all evil, I asked him, do you want to have a car when you get older, when you turn 16? He was like, yeah. I'm like, do you want to have a house? Yeah. And so the idea is that if you have a belief that money is the root of all evil, then you're going to find a way to get rid of money.
Right.
Subconsciously.
Right.
And so it kind of is the same way when it comes to other beliefs that we have.
My other takeaway, I was trying to leave a little space for Kevin to come in if he wanted. But
yeah.
My other takeaway, there were many takeaways, and I really recommend anybody who has any questions about how to deal, because my big fear is always doing the wrong thing. And your book really, for me, kind of loosened up the idea that trying is the right thing. And so I really appreciated that. But I have never, you were talking about suicide, that there is a perception by some people that, because we all know that there's a high rate of suicide among homosexual people, and that it's part of queer phobia, that it's talked about a lot. And I had never heard the interpretation that it was because they were queer that they would commit suicide. I've always thought that it was because of the way they were treated. And I hadn't ever thought about that dichotomy of blaming it versus trying to understand. I guess that's the way I would frame it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think it speaks to the pathologizing that is so pervasive when it does come to gender and sexual minority groups, is that there's the pathologizing. And so a lot of the onus is placed on the person, meaning like, I'm at high risk because I'm gay, or I'm at high risk for sexual promiscuity because I'm gay, or substance use because I'm gay. Whereas we have to shift the focus that it's not because I'm gay, it's because of the societal oppression that is experienced. And so to kind of parse those out, and that has to do with language and how we talk about communities. And I think that that's where, because I hear it. I hear it with the clients that I work with. I have a wide range of clients. My youngest client is 20 years old, and my oldest client is 63. And no matter what age, I hear the same kind of stories about the parents' concern when their child came out.
The internalized shame is something that is going to happen no matter what age you are. But when we're talking about young people, I mean, their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, and they don't have the tools fully developed yet to kind of talk through this with themselves, and especially if they're in a place or in a family where they don't have anybody else to talk to about it, that's where the real danger is because they're putting all of these things on themselves. This part of their development is going through such turmoil, and they don't have the mechanisms to deal with it. And so that's where we get some of these manifestations, whether it's suicide. I mean, you talk about drug and alcohol use, so that's where we get into some of these sort of downward spirals.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point, Kevin, because one of the things I talk to parents a lot about, whether it's any subject, it's if anything's happening or going on in the family, it's always talking to the child about letting them know that it's not their fault.
Absolutely.
Because like you said about the internalization, is that children will automatically, whether it has to do with divorce, addiction, like anything that's going on in the family, if something happens and there's a shift, the child's go-to is that it's my fault, I did something wrong.
Right.
And so for an LGBTQ youth, they're constantly just assessing the room for any sort of physical cue to let someone know that they're seen and that they're safe. And if someone doesn't respond to them in a way that lets them know that they are, they'll interpret that and internalize that as something's wrong with me. And that's where the internalized shame, the internalized queer phobia seeps in.
And you can't be fooled if you could be the most out person that's young. You could be dressing outside of your gender norm to the extreme, but that doesn't mean that you're not still going through all of those struggles. And in fact, you're probably going through it more, and you're using all of these manifestations as a way to sort of a defense mechanism in a way. I'm going to be the most out person that I can be to protect myself.
Absolutely. That's a really, really good point, Kevin, because that is the difference we talk about in my program, the difference between healthy pride. And so what you just described is often an experience of an LGBTQ youth who is defense. And that's not to say blanket the case with everyone who is, showing a rainbow flag, but that is a very good point for us as adults to be aware of, that just because a child or youth isn't showing us, or we don't see the effects of shame, that doesn't mean that it's not there.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Here comes Serena.
Well, at this time, I think it'd be great to open it up to any audience questions or comments to see if they'd like to join in the conversation. And we'll see if we can field any of those questions that anyone might have. You can drop those in the Q&A or put them in the chat. And then I wanted to just kind of jump on what you guys were just talking about as well, about the shame and the showing outwardly but hiding inwardly. It's even in I was just going to say, even in different communities, you see that as well, that sometimes there's this outward appearance that seems to be there, but you never know what's underneath that surface. And so I think also that can lend to a person's personality type too, so that outward facing extrovert, right, might be able to put something out there, but inside is really what's beneath the surface,
Yeah. And I think, I really, one of my hopes and my messages, with my book is that, parenting is not easy. Raising kids is not easy. Teaching is not easy. And humans, we're complex, and it's this isn't a one-time conversation. It's not a one-size-fits-all conversation. And it's an ongoing conversation. I was just talking to my brother about his son, my nephew, who, is at the age where he has a girlfriend right now. They've been together for a long time. And so I asked my brother, like, are you having conversations with them about sex? And, you know, he's about to graduate high school. And my brother said, you know, they've talked about it once or twice. And, you know, I invited him to consider that this is an ongoing conversation, and we get to, and even if we're uncomfortable, that's still okay, because in my experience, youth, kids, like, they respond to authenticity. And so it's in the desire to want to do good by them that they're going to pick up on. Mm-hmm. And so, especially when it comes to LGBTQ matters, language, things are changing so fast. And what I often tell parents is, like, this, you know, don't focus on keeping up, focus on keeping open. And there's going to be a rupture. Mm-hmm. But ruptures are the opportunity for us to make a repair. And it's in the repair that we grow stronger in our relationships. And we get to model that to a young person.
So we have a comment in the chat. Something that I saw on a billboard in my city that I think was really good was 1, 2, 3, 4. Open up that closet door. 5, 6, 7, 8. Don't assume your kids are straight.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then Angela Briones, she said earlier, it was fine that you shared that story. She says, Chris, I have a family member who accepts me and my girlfriend, but who also won't allow her own grandchildren to have anything with a rainbow symbol on it. As an out and proud lesbian, this obviously hurts and affects me. What is the best way to initiate a conversation about allyship and harmful messages with someone who is a partial ally? Also, thank you for your book. It has been very impactful. Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. Thank you. Hi, Angela. I can't see you, but thank you for being here. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that sometimes when it comes to family dynamics, it's complex. And I think that when, in my experience, there are ways that I can live my life that aren't necessarily going to change another person overnight. And so if I can do things in my own life that are authentic to myself, and for example, with my nieces and nephews or my family, what I started to do to start having these conversations was when I wasn't in town living in because I don't live in Arizona, I would get them books for Christmas, my nieces and nephews books for Christmas, LGBTQ related books for Christmas. And I gotta say, my brother-in-law was not thrilled, you know, by that. And that was something that I knew that he's the parent, and I knew that he is my niece and nephew's father. And so there are things that I can do, and there are things that are just out of my control. And so as long as I'm showing up and being myself authentically and doing things that I can do that are not sacrificing the integrity of someone else's family, that's really all I can do. And so I know that sometimes we want a quick fix when it comes to certain matters, and sometimes it just takes a little more time. And so I think a great way would be, she said her family member was a partial ally. So what I hear with that is a door's open. And so maybe it's getting a book, maybe it's kind of just inviting a conversation or bringing up a certain topic or sending an article, just little things. If she so chooses, because sometimes it does take emotional labor to do that. And not everyone wants to do not everyone wants to, or nor should they have to do the emotional labor. I just don't mind doing it.
So did you have a conversation with your brother-in-law? Did you keep giving books? Or
I did. And I gotta say, when my book came out, no pun intended, my family went from not having conversations with their kids because they didn't know how to my sister and niece reading my book. Right. My niece, she's a huge reader. She just loves reading, but she read my book 3 times, and and I think part of it's because I'm her uncle, but just that itself was a huge shift.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible that she wouldn't have, the person who asked the question, it's possible that she wouldn't have even been a partial ally if not for you. Because I think once we're able to know people, and we do know someone who is gay, trans, whatever, then we're able to learn more about that part of them. But
Yeah.
if we close ourselves off to even learning about other people beyond the surface, then we'll never even get the chance to know all parts of them. So I think that's an important part of allyship, is making sure that you're creating a space for the people that you interact with that lets them feel comfortable enough to share different parts of themselves.
Yes.
Anyone have any other questions for our panel? Such a quiet group. Yes, we've got another one here. Okay, Chad Pevido says, very proud that SU is doing this event. Thanks to the panelists, I've worked in ministry and higher education with youth and young adults for decades now. Currently co-teaching a course at TCU called The Art and Science of Human Flourishing. TCU and SU students are hopefully getting an education embracing of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Mm-hmm. What advice would y'all, each panelist, starting with Chris, give to college students today who desire to help their families understand the educations that they are getting, especially in regards to being allies to LGBTQ dynamics, aside from read the book, which seems like great advice?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I love the words desire. And to me, desire evokes curiosity. And so I guess when it comes to youth and including conversations, inviting parents, it's just kind of leaning into that curiosity and leaning into that desire and being willing to have conversations. I think when it comes to family members, asking questions, I think that that's a really great starting place, is to ask questions, because I know in my own life, when I started asking questions about my family, I was able to uncover a lot of the beliefs that they had that were passed down from their parents. And then we were able to kind of start poking holes in some of the things that maybe didn't make sense for us anymore. So I think that would be my response.
What's awesome about a Southwestern education and any liberal arts education is that it challenges your beliefs that you enter into any class with or any campus with. And I think that's what, a parent who's sending their kids to that kind of school would hope to see from their kids, is how their horizons are broadening, how they're learning about different experiences. And this is just one part of those experiences that they're learning about. So just making connections between different, whether it's psychology, history, in a literature class, making those connections between the human experience and what that means that might be challenging their beliefs that they had, or the way that it's just broadening their horizons. I think that's how I would hope a university student would want to talk to their parents about what they're learning, rather than, I read this book, I read this study, I wrote this paper that said this. It's more about the discussions that we have and the commonalities that we can find with each other.
I will say that not everybody who comes to Southwestern, not all their parents are as happy about the education as some. Although there are many whose kids don't even think about Southwestern because the family would be fearful of a liberal arts education. Even though it's called liberal arts, they hear it as liberal. But what I would say and this is something I've had to really learn for myself, is I used to go head on with people that I disagreed with. And I have learned to say, I don't see it that way. And I find that people are much more willing to listen. It's direct, but it's not confrontive. So I don't see it that way. It's a really good response when you're in conversation with someone who is on the opposite side of something.
We've got time for one more question. At what age can a child really know that he or she is queer or gay?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think there's one answer for every child, because every child is going to have their own experience that's unique to them. We do know that gender comes before sexuality, so a child does have a sense of their gender identity. That can change. Someone's gender journey can be a lifetime. So I don't think that there's like a one answer. My rule of thumb when I have these conversations with families is that when children are asking questions, they're capable of understanding. So for example, my nephew, when he asked me whether or not I had a girlfriend, he's capable of understanding why I wouldn't have a girlfriend. And so, kind of coming at it with that understanding, because children, just by virtue of being socialized in a dominant culture, they're already learning what it means, mommy, daddy, if they come from a, heteronormative family. I share a story in my book about the preschool that's right next to my house, and the little girl asking me, whether I was a boy or a girl. And that came from her beliefs that she's just received from the society that she's living in.
And young kids, as adults, we want to label things and place things in a box because that makes it easier for us. And kids don't always think about it that way. And so a kid that is exploring what they might think about their sexuality might not wake up one day and be like, I'm gay. But they know that I saw this person, or I felt this way, or I saw this thing or read this thing and I identified with that. And they might not know how to label it. They might not know if they should label it, but they know that there's something going on. And so even though they're not able to, put themselves in a category, they're starting to develop those thoughts pretty early.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you all for your questions and comments. I'd like to allow some time for our panelists to end with their final thoughts. Chris has another commitment immediately following this one, so I invite him to go ahead and go first so he can go ahead and sign off and prepare for that.
Yeah, my final thoughts, I grateful is the word that comes to my mind. I'm just really grateful that you've extended me, that you've read my book, that you're talking about my book, and most importantly, its message. I think I'm just eternally grateful to be continuing to have these conversations. I've had people reach out to me who are friends of mine who live in Texas, and that they're just really excited that their local community is having these conversations. Members of the community who maybe feel like Texas in general isn't as open or affirming. And so I'm just grateful to be having these conversations with more communities. So I guess my final thoughts would be gratitude. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Kevin?
I guess identity is so important to all of us. And I think that when it comes to being an ally, being open to the experiences of others and also understanding what about ourselves might make it easier or more difficult for others to express their identity, no matter what that is, whether it's a religious identity, a political identity. I'm thankful that, like Chris said, that these conversations are ongoing, because no identity is going to be able to flourish if communication isn't able to happen, because without the communication, we aren't able to see each other. It happens verbally, it happens non-verbally, and things happen unconsciously or subconsciously that can make a divide between that. And so I think that just awareness and continuing to explore and grow is so important. And just being here for the people that are here is a big part of that. So thank you.
I'm a last minute substitute, and I had signed up because I wanted to hear what people say about raising LGBTQ allies, and I wanted to learn more. And so I would say that my takeaway is thank you for having me read the book before the conversation, because I was going to try to absorb some and then read. I do that sometimes. But also Sarah McCutcheon, who I replaced, is actually raising an LGBTQ ally, and I watched that little girl on Facebook, and I think she is so joyous and so lucky to have Sarah as one of her moms, that I feel that kind of example would be really useful to people who are really on this journey with me, trying to be a better ally. So I would encourage you to find your own examples. So many Southwestern students and faculty, and then since that time, LGBTQ communities in the places where I am have been such so open to me in my learning. And so I would encourage people to find those people and those communities who can keep you on your journey. Excuse me. Sarah's not on because she's coughing, and I think it must be contagious across the miles. It's so good to see folks who are on the call and to see y'all and to participate with you.
Well, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. Remember, this is being recorded, so we'll have it available on our on-demand streaming page. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for being here, and have a good evening.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kevin and Terry and Serena.